Hello everyone, my name is Matthew Unger, and tonight I am joined by Claudia Binding, Jennifer Blanco, and John Horn. Welcome to our debate tonight, where we'll be discussing the rights of individuals who have been diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. Now, in particular, we'll be talking about the rights of these individuals to exercise their personal liberties, and how that can sometimes be complicated by the need for habilitation. So as many of you know, according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disability which can include deficits in verbal and social communication, and often these are presented with restricted interests or repetitive behaviors. Now, when we discuss the rights of these individuals, we're talking about everything that's guaranteed to them as a citizen of this country. These are the protections afforded under the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, but it goes further than that. Now, these documents merely reinforce the idea that these rights are intrinsic to the individual. They're not granted by the government or any institution. However, these rights have been violated in the past, whether intentionally or due to ignorance. Some of the perpetrators are the same individuals who are tasked with providing aid to those with a disability. Now, this has led to the formation of many laws regarding the rights of these individuals. Now, whether it is the Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights, which was passed in 1979, or the more recent Individuals with Disabilities Education Act from 1990, the interventions used to treat such individuals are constantly evolving, and with them, the laws must continue to adapt as well. Now, this is important as we must all strive to ensure that the rights and civil liberties of all individuals are being recognized. Now, with that being said, because of the deficits that many individuals on the autism spectrum face, there's a certain level of aid that each person may require as they age and develop. Luckily, there are many different services in place to help these individuals overcome and cope with their disability. Most of these services fall under the practice of Applied Behavioral Analysis, or ABA. Now, ABA deals with behavior and the function behind it. If behavior is not socially acceptable, the therapy teams will seek to shape that behavior using reinforcement and far less often punishment. ABA also takes an approach that seeks to prevent the likelihood of these problem behaviors happening in the first place. By providing clients with socially appropriate behaviors that serve a function, the chances that problem behaviors will occur is far less likely. Now, the practice of ABA has been shaped by these past abuses. Behavior analysts are governed by a code of ethics that has been created by the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. Professionals in the field are regulated and expected to operate in an ethical manner. But this is where the challenge occurs. In many of these interventions, it is necessary to ignore or block behaviors which may put the interventionists, or that may put the interventions at odds with the individual's civil liberties. The question becomes, at what point, if any, does the need for habilitation of behavior outweigh the rights of the individual? Now, first we're going to go to John Horn, who's going to be talking a little bit more about the rights that these individuals possess. John?
Thanks, Matt. My name is John, and I will be presenting arguments from the side of protecting the liberties of individuals with disabilities, such as autism spectrum disorders. My position is that despite the potential benefits of any habilitation, maybe through applied behavior analysis, it should not be implemented if it restricts or limits the rights of others in any way. So, to be specific, when I'm referring to rights and liberties, I'm referring to those that are described within the U.S. Constitution. Some of those are like freedom of speech, equal protection, or freedom of religion. However, for this debate, rights and liberties are also going to be more basic in definition. For example, in a 1973 court case, Doe versus Bolton, liberty was defined as freedom from restraint and the power to follow one's own will to choose a course of conduct, or the right to be let alone, the privilege of an individual to plan his own affairs, to shape his own life as he thinks best, do what he pleases, go where he pleases, freedom from bodily restraint or compulsion, freedom to walk, stroll, or loaf. So you can see that it goes beyond just a constitutional definition and has a lot more to do with an individual's preferences and choices as well. A person's rights are considered inalienable. That is, they are not granted by a government or any other institution, but they are retained by the person. So a person has rights just because they breathe, because they exist as a person. No other factors contribute to whether or not a person has rights. In 2004, Gaustin and others described the conditions around international human rights, specifically in reference to individuals with mental disabilities. They stated that governments do not possess the power to grant or deny human rights and freedoms. Persons possess rights simply because of their humanity. Thus, persons with mental disabilities need not prove that they deserve certain rights or that they can be trusted to exercise them in socially and culturally acceptable ways. There has historically been and continues to be much discussion concerning how someone's personal liberties interfaces with the world that they live in, such as the interface between someone's personal liberties and a proposed habilitation plan. I would argue that someone's personal rights or liberties are not matters of discussion based on current research or empirical validation. Personal rights and liberties cannot be proven to exist or not exist, but someone's rights and liberties are to be a given or an assumed quality about the person. Any factors that influences a person's life, such as habilitation, should start with this as the basic premise. So based on this definition, no matter what the goal is, on what grounds does someone have a right to limit the rights of another person?
All right, thank you for that, John. Next, we'll be hearing from Claudia, and specifically, she's going to be talking about, does the practice of ABA, respect the rights of these individuals, Claudia? What do you think on that topic?
Hi, I'm Claudia Finding, and as Matt mentioned, I'm going to talk about how ABA actually, in fact, does respect these choices. I agree with John that the rights of an individual are paramount, and it should always be upheld. ABA doesn't limit these choices, but instead enhances them. Choice is essential for any humans functioning and development, according to Erickson, and choice can be a core component of development starting as early as 18 months of age. The goal of ABA is never to remove the rights of a person permanently, but it's to teach different skills and then generalize the skills for choice making. ASD, by definition, has deficits in social skills and communication. ABA works to strengthen these skills so that they can practice their personal liberties better and live a higher quality of life. By using habilitation, we teach children how to generalize their decision-making skills through things like requesting for items, saying no, etc. Ethically, ABA therapists should be fading their prompts when teaching these skills so that the skill can generalize and be used independently. This skill has to generalize. Generalization is a core component of applied behavioral analysis. By teaching choice, we also better incorporate the individual's preferences and choices into treatment, which is in compliance with Ethical Code 2.09 of the BACB Code of Ethics. According to Wyatt and Stickney in 1975, habilitation gives each of them, the clients with developmental deficits, a realistic opportunity to lead a more useful and meaningful life. So John makes a valid argument that these rights are inalienable, and they are. ABA just enhances these rights by teaching them these skills.
All right, thank you, Claudia. So, John, Claudia's made the claim that the ABA does not only respect the rights of these individuals, but it actually enhances the rights. So what would your response be to that?
Well, Claudia's points do make a lot of sense. However, what she described is what should happen, but what tends to happen in many settings is very different. It was interesting that Claudia, that you mentioned Wyatt versus Stickney, because we don't have to look back that far to see that there's an extensive history of abuse and mistreatment toward individuals with disabilities like autism spectrum disorder. Though it's not necessarily occurring at the same level today as it was at the time of Wyatt versus Stickney. It wasn't that long ago, and abuse still regularly occurs today. There's mistreatment and neglect regularly in group homes. And I would argue that what's happening, for example, in the Judge Rottenberg Center with the shock therapy is unethical and mistreatment toward those individuals who attend the Judge Rottenberg Center. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Center describes abuse and mistreatment, and whether happening today or in the past, has most often occurred at the hands of those who are supposed to be the care providers. So the ones who are developing the habilitation plans, whether it be applied behavior analysis or other behavior modification. In fact, it wasn't until very recent history, the 1970s, that the rights of individuals with disabilities were protected or upheld in any meaningful way. And these changes did not come about due to advanced or improved forms of habilitation or evidence-based practices, but they came about because the public was finally made aware of the egregious disregard for the care of folks in those settings. The Wyatt versus Stickney case occurred following the public awareness of the abuses at Bryce State Hospital in Tuscaloosa. But around the same time, similar abuses were found to be occurring in different settings across the country. I know for our class we read about what happened in Sunland, Miami, at Sunland Hospital in Miami, and also Willowbrook State School in Staten Island. And there's a similar situation in that those abuses were not stopped until the abuses were brought to light, either through journalistic efforts or people employed on the inside bringing this to public attention. Partially as a result of these tragedies, legislation and guaranteed protections were provided. Some legislation includes the Developmental and Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Those not necessarily coming out of legislation related to these tragedies, but there was a push at that time, especially in the 70s, to provide protection for these folks. Specifically out of the Wyatt versus Stickney case at Bryce State Hospital, individuals with disabilities have a right to receive individual habilitation, as will give each of them a realistic opportunity to lead a more useful and meaningful life and to return to society. Also, minimum standards like individualized habilitation plans, a humane physical environment, and assurance of enough qualified staff to administer adequate treatment. So a lot of positive changes have occurred, but despite these positive changes, some groups like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network have argued that these rights are not always upheld and individuals do not always receive the supports that are mandated by law. For example, agencies like the Judge Rottenberg Center continue to use shock therapy, ignoring ethical codes that mandate the use of least restrictive procedures and using reinforcement-based strategies before ever attempting punishment strategies, such as defined in the compliance codes for behavior analysts 4.0, 4.08, and 4.09. Individuals with disabilities like autism spectrum disorder are a population that is particularly vulnerable to abuse. Effective habilitation is a right mandated by law, but when considering habilitation that may infringe on their rights and liberties, we need to err on the side of protecting their rights and liberties. Without erring on the side of liberty with public means of accountability, our society has repeatedly shown a propensity to ignore their rights or display abusive behavior toward individuals with disabilities like ASD. To further support this point, here is a video that represents what can happen when liberties are ignored for the sake of habilitation.
All right, thank you, John. I'm queuing up that video right now. right, sorry about the technical difficulty. It looks like, so we're going to be presenting it over here. All right, go ahead.
Dramatic video of New York teenager Andre McCollins restrained face down, a helmet on his head, screaming for help. Judge Rotenberg Center calls it treatment.
We're shocked when we're 16 or 17.
Alright, so I think we had a little trouble with the video actually showing, but I think the audio from it is probably enough to make the point. Alright, sorry about that. Anyways, back to the debate. So we have heard from John, and he was talking about the past abuses that have happened in the field. And so next we're going to talk to Jenny, I believe, about the... I'm sorry, was it Jenny or Claudia who was speaking next?
I believe it's Jenny.
Okay, so yeah, we're going to hear from Jenny and her response to that. Okay.
Hi, I'm Jennifer. I'm going to be presenting along with Claudia about the pros of habilitation versus personal liberties. And then just to comment to John, while I agree that the abuses you mentioned are completely unethical, this is merely the acts of a minority group in the behavior field rather than the majority. Circumstances like this arise when professionals are not properly trained or are not constrained by our strict ethical guidelines. The professional and ethical compliance codes, when practiced responsibly, will in fact protect the individual from the abuses you mentioned, as well as many other ethical concerns. However, when the individual's behavior presents a significant risk of harm to that individual or others around, it is sometimes necessary to restrict or limit the rights of the individual. Punishment procedures may need to be implemented in this circumstance. In the 1980s and 1990s, a debate occurred within the field of behavior analysis, wherein the two sides included the right to behavioral treatment and freedom from harm. The right to behavioral treatment group argued that while minimized use of punishers is desirable, they might be necessary to reduce challenging behaviors. Examples of punishment techniques include response blocking or timeout procedures. More punitive methods, like the ones you mentioned, John, may include electric shock in the most severe cases. The Freedom from Harm group believed that functional analysis and behavioral approaches based on antecedent and reinforcement strategies have also been just as effective in reducing challenging behaviors. These strategies may include differential reinforcement, functional communication training, positive behavior supports, etc. While punishment strategies have been shown to reduce challenging behaviors, they should only be implemented after reinforcement procedures have been shown to be unsuccessful in alleviating problem behaviors on their own. This principle is supported by Section 4.08b of the BACB Professional and Ethical Compliance Code for Behavior Analysts. So just to sum that up, basically when the individual is presenting, a risk of harm to other individuals or themselves, it sometimes is necessary to restrict those rights just to be on the safe side and to keep everyone safe in the environment.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. Just confusing people up all over the place. So basically what you're saying is that in certain situations, punishers can be used, but those situations are strongly regulated by the Code of Ethics that people providing these interventions are supposed to follow. I know that there's other criticisms that ABA has received. I know one of those specifically has been that it doesn't actually teach the individuals how to function in an adaptable manner. Basically, what I mean by that is that ABA is too robotic in nature. It can be difficult to generalize the skills in a way that benefits the individual, and instead, ABA has been accused of not respecting the individual's specific characteristics, as in like the things that make that individual themselves. And, certain groups such as the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network use the slogan, "Nothing about us without us." Basically, what they're saying is, they're not anti-ABA. They just stress that it must be done in an ethical manner and that individuals on the spectrum have to be involved in that conversation. So basically, these self-advocacy groups view autism spectrum disorder as having its own culture. So the individuals that have or who are on the spectrum, they have a shared way of thinking, behaving, and interacting. And they say that when this individual is habilitated, they're being taught how to pass as normal. So not only does this really kind of belittle the individual, but it undermines the idea that they have a shared culture. So basically, we're saying to them that they're wrong or they're somehow less. And many of these harsh criticisms not only come from the self-advocates, but it comes from parents or the caregivers of these individuals as well. So obviously the parents aren't going to have as much knowledge of ABA, and if they go into that situation, sometimes it can be hard to watch. They see their children going through these extremely stressful situations. Some have reacted in an understandable manner by removing the services. I know one parent, so we've looked at different blogs and different things that the parents have said. In one post, someone compared it to basically telling someone who identifies as homosexual that they'd be happier in life if they remain closeted. They say that ABA seems to be centered around the idea of fixing the child, or that autism is incompatible with humanity, with one parent saying either you're autistic or you're human, as in that's the idea that ABA is putting forward. Other parents have described it as dog training for humans. How would you respond to such allegations by parents who are going to be such an integral part of the intervention process?
Matt, think back for a moment when you first learned how to ride your bike. Were you able just to climb on the bike and ride down the road? Of course not. It took baby steps. You learned one step at a time, pedal by pedal. Similarly, ABA works one step at a time to teach a skill. You're right. At the beginning of a program, we do teach a lot of our skills in isolation, without necessarily focusing on why we're teaching these skills. But similarly to riding a bike, you need to first learn how to move each pedal forward before riding a bike begins to matter as a means of transportation. People with developmental disabilities like ASD may sometimes need this additional habilitation. They often lack the skills, or they may lack the skills necessary to function adaptively within society. For example, they may not be able to appropriately request for items, bathe by themselves, use the bathroom independently, wait appropriately. You can't dress yourself unless you learn how to button and unbutton your shirts or how to take them off, things like that. Some caregivers, you're right, fear habilitation, that it removes the individual's creative choice. But ABA focuses on implementing programs to enhance daily living, enhance communication skills, and choice making. Some clients, like I mentioned, need to be taught how to make choices before they're able to utilize this skill independently. Just like you first have to learn to move the pedal before you can ride the bike by yourself. As decided in Candela and Associates in 2005, as well as in Bain in 1990. So the question becomes one of determining which holds precedent over the other. Is it more important to recognize the rights of the individual immediately, or instill with them the skills necessary to flourish? It's my and Jenny's belief that it's important to teach these skills first and then teach why it's important and how to use it independently. Your concerns, as well as the concerns of parents, are valid and need to be acknowledged, but you need to look at the bigger picture. Would you rather know that a bike is important for transportation, or would you rather learn how to ride the bike so that you can get from one place to another by yourself and make your own choice?
Okay. So to answer your rhetorical question, I believe both are important, but I think what you're trying to say is that the practice of ABA strives to teach both of these things. So it's not that one's being targeted while the other's being ignored. It's just that first you have to teach someone how to do something before you teach the importance of doing it or how to generalize it to other situations.
Absolutely.
All right. So next we're going to talk about basically the different aspects of ABA, the different routines and schedules and everything that go into it, and how that affects the clients.
All right, thanks, Matt. So we've been discussing habilitation in ways that really help develop skills and train new behaviors, and those are good things. Those are something that I think we can all agree on. We've also discussed habilitation that's been implemented in ways that include the harsh restriction of rights and the uses of punishers or aversives like shock. So Jenny and Claudia, you're describing habilitation and how it can enhance choice and therefore capacity to enjoy rights and liberties. And I agree that this can happen and should happen. However, once again, I think, well, when we're talking about what can and should happen, it isn't always what does happen. I think there are logistical challenges in many settings. Sometimes these like group homes or day programs for adults have a hard enough time just keeping the health and safety number of staff on board. So that affects the how habilitation is implemented. So you could have the best plan in the world, but due to these logistical challenges, they don't always work out. And in some ways, and in subtle ways, the habilitation can infringe on the liberties of others and result in a loss of autonomy. So again, habilitation is a right. But individuals with disabilities are a vulnerable population, and they may not always have the adequate supports or the advocates available to truly protect their rights or voice their choices. And with the absence of these supports in these different settings, it may be easy for service providers to choose what they think is best, but to ignore an individual's expression of choice or preference. So somebody maybe with ASD isn't as adept at communicating their wants and needs, and in the absence of that, or people really taking the time and energy and effort to hear how they are communicating their preferences, their choices are sometimes choices are made for them. So staff can do what they think is best and ignore an individual's expression of choice. Bannerman in 1990 talked about how service providers often choose the client's habilitative goals, choose their work or day treatment setting, impose inflexible daily activity schedules, and regulate access to preferred activities. The choices made by the service providers may indeed promote habilitation, but these choices may not reflect the client's preference. Again, according to Bannerman, individuals may not be given the opportunities of choice making regarding goals or treatment approaches, and their own preferences may not be included in daily activities due to the preference of a provider or the logistical challenges of maybe it's a 12-bed residence and they're trying to get 12 people ready to attend their day hab setting. And so it's a lot of structure and work and effort with less focus on the habilitative aspects. In other areas of daily living, individuals may not be made fully aware of their choices and rights and therefore don't know to utilize them.
Okay, so you still have some concerns. I mean, how would you guys who are defending the practice of ABA, how would you respond to that? Like, can you give me any examples specifically of how you include choice in the interventions that you guys are providing?
Yeah, absolutely. We use incorporating choice when we do things like preference assessments or allowing the client to choose which reinforcers they want to work for, activities that they want to do, etc. John, it's interesting that you mentioned Bannerman's findings. It's unfortunate that this does occur in some settings, but behavioral analysts have to abide by the law and provide the most effective treatment possible which means incorporating the individual's preferences and choices into the treatment plan. We're required to do this not by our own moral standards, but also by the BACB Code of Ethics, again, number 2.09. Studies, to counter yours, such as that of Lowerman, Aroke, and Yerman in 2001, have demonstrated that incorporating choice in treatment can actually reduce problem behaviors. This is also further confirmed by a study of Canella, O'Reilly, and Lancioni in 2005. Cole and Levinson in 2002 also determined that incorporating choice into treatment plans increases task engagement and attentiveness, which is important when we want a child to learn the skill in the best manner possible. We want them to succeed. Canella, O'Reilly, and Lancioni reviewed 30 different studies and further confirmed all of the findings I previously mentioned and suggest that incorporating choice and preference assessments should be incorporated whenever possible, whether in the therapy sessions, in the classroom setting, the clinic setting, or in the home for individuals with disabilities. Based on these studies, 20 of the 30 studies on choice and preference assessment reported positive results. 9 of these 30 studies reported mixed results, and only 1 study reported negative results. So behavior analysts should be providing treatment that is supported by research, which means that we have to allow the client to make choices in regards to their treatment plan when they're able to and whenever possible. But first, for some of our early learners, we may need to still teach these things, which means restricting their rights for a limited time period of time, and then working towards fading these prompts so that they can make choices independently. That is the only ethical way to provide services based off of the compliance codes of the BACB Code of Ethics and the research that is out there.
Okay. So I think at this point we're going to have to move on to our final statements. So John, first I'm going to go to you. What's your final thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, just to quickly reply to what Claudia said too, I think the research is positive, and it does show that when choice is incorporated, it enhances habilitation, and hopefully down the line, if we're working with children and we're able to develop their ability to exercise choice in socially acceptable ways, that we may not have to have this conversation as much as we are now. So choice making is important, but again, all too often choices of individuals like those with ASD are still neglected due to the structure in their setting, or limited as they are deemed maybe to lack capacity. I think sometimes we make mistakes when we try to determine when someone has capacity or doesn't to make independent choices. And I think this is more relevant when we're talking about adults. Maybe they're living in a group home or attending a day program. So we have in those situations, I would make the case that we have an ethical obligation to respect the person's autonomy, which is a core ethical principle that undergirds the compliance codes. Just because someone has a habit of taking maybe long naps, as Bannerman talks about, or watching TV for long periods of time, or they enjoy junk food, that doesn't always mean that the person should receive habilitation services. After all, many people without any disabilities make the same decisions in regard to their personal health and do not receive services. This is normal. When persons with disabilities, such as ASD or intellectual disability, make decisions like spending long periods of time in leisure activities, or maybe they're making poor dietary decisions, some would argue that they do not have the capacity to make choices independently. However, it can be stated that this is a right of all the citizens to make these choices for themselves. A responsible behavior analyst needs to support the client's legal rights and prerogatives, like Code 2.05 says. The opportunities to make independent choices, even choices that are not the healthiest, may be necessary to increase autonomy and gain increased skill in the area of choice making. Each situation should be approached individually based on a person's specific needs, but it should not be assumed that having a disability will generally result in an inability to make independent choices. On the other hand, removing these opportunities may have a deleterious effect on a person's quality of life and ability to gain autonomy in their lives. A person has a right to make mistakes or to decide to do something incorrectly. There was a phrase that was coined by Robert Persky in 1972, and it was the dignity of risk. And this was used to describe the right for individuals, specifically Robert Persky was referring to individuals with intellectual disability. But it describes the right to take risks in daily life and have the opportunity to fail when taking those risks. And failure does not imply or justify the loss of rights. So I think we need to be careful when we are providing habilitation and not just infringing on somebody's liberties and rights just because they have a disability. I think we put everything on paper sometimes with behavior plans or ISPs or IEPs, and sometimes when we have every detail of somebody's life on paper, we can sometimes treat them differently than we would treat ourselves, and sometimes we might even hold folks with disabilities, maybe like autism spectrum disorders, we can hold them to a higher standard than we hold ourselves. In closing, if ABA services are going to be provided, and that's the example of habilitation that we're using in this study or in this debate, if they're going to be provided, they need to occur in a way that enhances autonomy and personal liberties, not restricting them. Over the last few decades, there have been advances in approaches like functional analysis, antecedent strategies, differential reinforcement strategies. And one example is the differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, functional communication training, such as demonstrated by Carr and Duran in 1985 and several studies thereafter. These approaches have been shown to be effective for reducing challenging behaviors that would otherwise be addressed through restrictive or reversive treatments like shock or exclusionary timeout. As time goes on and the appropriate amount of research attention is provided to these types of approaches, we may not need to have this debate like we are now. Punishers or other rights restrictions that may happen during habilitation may no longer be recommended once reinforcement strategies have been tried. Perhaps our technology and reinforcement strategies or antecedent strategies will be advanced enough and trialed enough that they'll be more effective. Other techniques like reinforcement, magnitude, or other ways that we can enhance or support differential reinforcement strategies. Our ethical obligation is to do no harm and respect autonomy, as well as the compliance codes to respect the rights and prerogatives of our clients. And these preclude us from suggesting habilitation that does otherwise.
All right, thank you, John. So it sounds like you're not against the practice of ABA. You're just strongly emphasizing the fact that we need to make sure that the choice is included, even if that choice is not so much in the individual's best interest.
Right.
Okay. So Jennifer, closing statements on ABA. If you'd like to respond to John, feel free.
Yeah, I do want to respond to John. While I agree that we should always uphold the principle of do no harm and respecting the individual's autonomy, it becomes a question of, do we prioritize those things over the individual's personal safety? You know, what do we do when the person is a harm to themselves or others? The authors Guest, Benson, and Siegel Causey in 2008 state that when individuals with disabilities are left to their own devices, sometimes they will decide to make behavioral decisions, either consciously or unconsciously, that may be potentially harmful or inappropriate. The authors associate this choice with a lack of information about behavioral consequences. They illustrate one individual with severe aggression and explain that this individual, when given the choice, will in fact choose to engage in aggressive behaviors with a therapist. Individuals diagnosed with ASD may lack the social awareness that constrains many neurotypicals' behavioral actions. In order to make positive choices, it is required that the individual possess the ability to make responsible actions and the capacity to evaluate those actions. And for some individuals with ASD, this may not come so easy. That is why it's of utmost importance to teach social awareness of any behavioral consequences in order to decrease or prevent future negative behaviors from occurring. It is also vital for treatment programs to focus on promoting the individual's autonomy and choice while providing the individual the opportunity to make informed decisions. So while I agree with many of the points John makes, I think there needs to be a balance between respecting those principles, core principles, do no harm, and respecting autonomy, but also balancing the individual's personal safety and the safety of others around, especially with, severe aggression or any other kind of potentially harmful behaviors.
All right, thank you. So I think what we've come down to at the end of this debate is basically no one's arguing really against the practice of ABA. Basically, the emphasis, and it seems like, honestly, everyone's kind of arguing from the same point, that we do need to include choice. We need to respect the rights of these individuals. I think the debate comes down more to, are these things happening? Are we allowing choice in our interventions? Are we making sure that we're following the code of ethics? So I think that's kind of where we're differing a little bit here. But I think what we can all say is that these interventions do, they help the individuals that are being treated with them. They're offering them more mobility, more independence. They're giving them the ability to exercise their rights more in the future after they've gone through these interventions. So I think the importance really is just making sure that we make sure that we're always being ethical, that we're always following the codes, that everything we're doing is in the best interest of the clients and not in our own interests. We're not doing things because it's the easy way to do it. We're doing it because it's right. So now we're going to go on to some questions. The first question, I believe, so this one is basically, without effective habilitation, will individuals develop maladaptive behaviors that pose a risk to themselves or others? And that's justifying a temporary suspension of rights. And for this one, I think we're going to go to Jenny, because she kind of talked on this topic a little bit before.
Yeah, so to answer this question, in the debate, I actually mentioned an example of a client with severe aggression that when given the choice, he would most likely engage in aggressive behaviors with his therapist. But I'd also like to give a personal example. A past client of mine, he was very highly reinforced by edibles and any food, snacks he was provided with, he would come to therapy with. They were high preference. So when it comes down to lunchtime, we would usually let him kind of, have access to his food, but we would moderate it so that he wasn't eating an abundance of food at one time, and there's the hazard of choking, and sometimes his group home would provide him meals that were not safe to eat, or if they had chicken bones still in them. You always have to watch how he's eating and make sure that he's not eating too fast, make sure that the bites are appropriate sizes. And basically to answer that question, I think that there should be a justification to suspend those rights temporarily for the benefit of the individual, to not put themselves at harm. Because they legally have the right to eat their food and to enjoy their food, but at what cost do we let the individual make those decisions for themselves? It's at the cost of putting themselves in danger, or possibly overeating, which leads to more severe medical issues, obesity, diabetes, choking. So it's all with good nature, and you have to have a balance of both.
All right, cool. So basically, there are certain situations where we do need to restrict the rights, especially if it's to the danger of the client or those around him. So for the second question, it's basically, should all individuals share the same basic human rights regardless of ability? I think I can answer this one. Basically, to put it bluntly, sorry, 1 second. Oh, I'm back. So yes, those individuals, I think that they should share the same human rights, the same basic human rights. I think when we're talking about the suspension of these people's rights, we're not talking about doing it long term. We're not saying that we're going to, permanently put them in, I mean, things that used to happen in the past, putting them in institutions where they don't have a lot of freedoms. I think the discussion now is centered more around looking at, you know, if we do need to temporarily restrict their rights, are we doing it in a way that's going to benefit them more positively in the future? So I think that they do deserve all the same rights that everyone has available to them. And I think that ABA respects that as well, that it's attempting to maintain these rights for these individuals. It's just that sometimes there does need to be a temporary suspension of these rights to make sure that we're teaching them the appropriate way to access these rights. Would anyone else like to add on to that answer?
Well, I can do question 3, and it's actually going to tail to how you answered question 2.
Sure thing. So for question 3, we have, as future BCBAs, what position would you take if you found yourself in the middle of this debate while serving a client? What compliance codes would you refer to guide your decision? So John?
Yeah, so similar to the situations described by Matt and Jenny so far, you had maybe an individual who was demonstrating a behavior, maybe aggression or self-injurious behavior or property destruction that was a safety risk, a risk of harm to self or others. And in these situations, there may need to be a temporary restriction of rights. What I think is important is first, I think we need to acknowledge the fact that we are restricting somebody's human rights, and we are limiting their rights and prerogatives in so doing. So I think we just need to be upfront about that. Oftentimes in these situations, there are human rights committees that oversee behavior plans that may include rights restrictions toward individuals. My experience has been in group home settings with young adults, and similar to how Jenny and Matt described, I worked with a young woman who displayed severe aggression. There were many staff injuries related to her behavior around food, and we did include some temporary rights restrictions in her group home, which included like locks on the pantry door. In so doing, it stabilized the environment enough where we were able to actually teach replacement behavior skills. We used a DRA. We taught communication strategies to communicate her desire for food rather than become immediately aggressive when it wasn't provided for her. And over time, over the course of it was about 6 months where she developed that new behavior, and she was able to communicate her wants and needs when it came to food, and we were able to remove those restrictions. And so in the long run, it was a temporary loss of restrictions, but now if she were to go, or when she does go to other settings, such as in the community, this behavior change has generalized to other settings. And so now she has skills to expand her experience in the community and in society. So some of the compliance codes that are relevant here is, first of all, we need to make sure that we're using least restrictive procedures as identified in 4.09. Also, we could have gone in a direction where we may have, when you're dealing with food, it's very easy to maybe introduce reinforcers that are potentially harmful, like stated in 4.10. And again, as always, we're talking about protecting the rights and prerogatives of the individuals. So in this situation, this woman was not the consent giver. Her consent giver was her mother, who does not live at the group home. So we had to obtain consent, which is part of the process. And 4.02, you try the best you can to include people involving clients in the consent process, but they may not always understand necessarily the extent of the behavior change program. So you have to keep the end goal in mind of the temporary suspension of rights will hopefully lead to a future capacity to enjoy more of their rights and their experiences.
All right, thank you for that. And to move on to our final question, so if as BCBAs you believe that habilitation is critical to facilitating individuals with ASD to access their personal liberties, is the fact that those who are high functioning often are not eligible for these services a violation of ethics? How would you advise a family with a young adult in this situation of having those services? Claudia? Your mic's muted, Claudia?
Of course, I did it again. My first question would be, how would you define high functioning in this situation? Are they able to make their own choices, voice their own opinions? What deficits do they struggle with? Are they able to practice their personal liberties? Do they understand what their personal liberties mean and the value behind them? If the answer isn't yes, then yeah, I would argue that it's unethical not to offer services to help the individual live a more fulfilling life and make more choices independently. Under the Ethical Codes, Section 2, we have to put the rights and the needs of our clients first and do what's best for them, do no harm. And I think by limiting their ability to learn to make their own choices is harmful. We as individuals strive to be independent and make independent choices all day long, so why shouldn't they? It's also under Section 6.02. I, as a behavioral analyst, should promote behavioral analysis whenever possible because I do in situations where I believe it's the most appropriate choice and to the benefit of the individual and all parties involved. So while I wouldn't be able to provide direct services for this family, I can consult with them and provide several suggestions. If the family with the young adult desire additional services like ABA and think it would be beneficial for the client, I would encourage them to speak to their service coordinators and investigate why the services are not being able to be funded to them and if there are alternative solutions. For example, if state funding doesn't allow for additional services or think this child's ineligible, what about insurance, looking at other funding sources? I would also encourage the family to include the child in IEP meetings and in the creation of IEP goals. Their thoughts matter, no matter how big or small. The rights of the client should be acknowledged and incorporated into routines, whether it's IEP goals in the classroom, routines in the home, choices in community outings, etc. Choices, no matter how big or small, matter. And according to the basic behavioral principles, there's a natural reinforcement associated with this behavior of choice. Which is similar to the way we as behavioral analysts reinforce appropriate behaviors. Now, if the individual isn't able to make appropriate decisions and is high functioning and is able to understand different explanations, I would encourage the parents to explain why the behavior isn't appropriate and then provide, whenever possible, an alternative solution to that behavior so that they may not engage in behavior A, but engaging in behavior B provides the same kind of function, it's just a more appropriate alternative, if that answers the question.
Oh yeah, thank you. It's quite comprehensive. So with that, that finishes our debate off. Just like to say thank you for joining us tonight. I believe this is the last debate of the semester, so enjoy. You are free now, everyone. Enjoy your holidays. I think that's it.